Good morning. Ayin Beis. We're going over the end of Ayin Beis again. So we learned it already. We're on page 1475 on top. Again, to put things into context, we're learning the Ayin Beis now in context of the Maimon Mika Hashem Elokeinu of the Alter Rebbe and Tere'er Chanukah, Miketz Chanukah. And the Mittler Rebbe is Maimoriad Muram Soi, Bereshis, the pages 382, approximately, yeah, those pages, where the discussion is about, ultimately we're going to spell out 3 levels of Yichud, but it's beginning with 2 levels of Yichudi Eloh, Yichudi Tata, Shema and Baruch Shem, or Hashem Elokeinu and Hashem Echad in Shema itself, which is also the 2 levels of Das Elyon and Das Tachten. So from our perspective, in Seder Ishtalshus, as he put it, is very clear, 2 different perspectives. One is, it's all Elokus, and how God sees everything, existence, and there, everything's bottled completely b'mitzias. Bitl b'mitzias, that's the words he used. The Das Tachten is bitl hayesh. There is an existence, but the existence is aligned with godliness. But when we say Mashakosu Kail Deis Havaya, means that from the Eibishter's point of view, on the other hand, he's Kail Beis Deis. Beis Deis, Das and Das Tachten. Hem Shneim Emes, Shneim Yechodim Be'ein Sof. Ubchins Bitl V'Ayin Mamish. That the lower level of Ayin and Bitl. And the action is just like on Yiddish. So then the question, and that is essentially what he says in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer as well. But then the question that Rebbe Rashab asked, 2 questions. According to this, it's not 2 levels of Ayin from God's perspective. It's Hakol B'chinas Ayin Achas, Ayin Echad, Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. So what do we mean by Yiddish and the Achrin? Begam, the Lefizeh, Lo Yesh Shum Isavas Klal. According to this, there's no Isavas. Isavas is only from our point of view. So he answered, but it says Bereshis Boris. You have to say the Isavas. So the answer is that there are 2 levels of Ayin, and there's Isavas because the Eibishter wanted it that way. It's not just due to our perspective. From the Eibishter's perspective, he essentially emanated 2 tracks, like he says. Ayin Beis is not a Hamshacha order from the Ayin Aleph. Beis Madregas Hamshacha Me'ein Sei Baruch Hu. Beis meaning Hamshachas. One is a Gilui Elikus Ayin Shalamaylim Gamrim from Yesh, and the second Ayin that's a Moked to the Yesh. So what does that do? If it was the way that the Eibishter is Lamayla from it all, and the Ayin is 1 level of Ayin, and from that comes another Ayin, so then you could say from the Eibishter's point of view, it all doesn't exist. But he wants it to exist. And mitzad the Eibishter's Ratzon, the Eibishter's plan, the Ratzon for Isavos, or the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, is just as legitimate as the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. So if that's the case, and by the Eibishter they're both like one, because they're both his, he doesn't say Yechelis here, but basically both his power. So, and Shneim Klulim Yechodim B'Atzmus Ein Sof, they're both miyuchad and Atzmus Ein Sof because they're both equally, like we learned before, just like the Koyach HaGili comes to the Eibishter, the Koyach HaHelam comes to the Eibishter, and so on. So then, how do they become 2? It says, V'nivdelu al yidei Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is what allows them to become 2 different tracks. In other words, from the Eibishter's point of view, they're like one. They're 2 different manifestations, but they're like one. The Tzimtzum allows them to become 2 that we, from our point of view, will see 2 different tracks. One, the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, one of the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. Though be'emes, they're really one, but there is a Metzias because the Eibishter wanted that second Ayin as well, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. So the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is not a result of Tzimtzum, it's a result of Ratzon Hashem. The Tzimtzum, however, allows it to be emerging. That's the Chiddush here. Because if he said that the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra came from the Ayin of Yesh HaMiti, then you could say, there's one Ayin of Yesh HaMiti. And through Tzimtzum, the Tzimtzum diminished it, so now it became an Elikus that relates to existence. Now, the Elikus that relates to existence comes from Atzmus directly. However, for it to be revealed, you need the Tzimtzum. That's the key difference in understanding this idea. So I actually looked up Teira Shalom that we learned inside, the Sikha of Simchas Teira Tov Reish Ayin Dalet, I believe. Yeah. Kamitzvus Misachzel Atzmus. And when I look there, I see, Mamish see there, the idea that he says here, where he clearly says that the Yichud Mamayla Lamata, he says clearly it's a Metzias, but it's not a Metzias. He said, Das it das und das it nicht das. Because Iu Tov is Bekula Alman, the Eina Dover Tov is, the Eina Dover, the Elam Eina Tef is Bay. That's what he says. Kol Tov, Iu Tov is Bekula Alman, and Alman is not Tefis in the Ebershter. Like we learned with the Mittler Rebbe's language. He says, I think the Rebbe Rashab also uses that. He says clearly that from the Ebershter's point of view, existence exists, but it's basically a power of God. That's called existence. From my point of view, since we don't see the Koyach Haliki, because it's Nelam, we see an existence. And the Kavon of Dira B'Tachtenim is that we should also see it the way the Ebershter sees it. That Tachtenim really is Tachtenim in the Helam, and there's no Gilead Lakus. But we should we should challenge that and transform that Helam, that we should see Tachtenim the way Atzmus sees Tachtenim, which is an expression of the Ebershter's Keiches. Just like Giluyim is an expression of the Ebershter's Giluyim, of Keiches. Okay. So just to add one more point here, which may be helpful. So we really have a few things here. 3 things I would say. One is the idea that the koyach to create existence, the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, is an equal koyach like the koyach to create an ayin that is beyond existence. And then there's the very Tzimtzum itself. Like we learned, Ein Oid comes from the Helam Ha'atzmi, that Tzimtzum itself is a koyach halaki. So when you talk about ayin, that's oir. There's 2 levels of oir. And both of them are equally coming from the Mokkah from Atzmus. The Tzimtzum is another koyach of the Eibishter to conceal, to separate between the two, so we shouldn't feel the divine, the elikus within within existence. And that comes from a koyach hahelam of Tzimtzum, which is yet another koyach. So in other words, the koyach is like eir hablikvul, eir hagvul, and there's koyach hagvul, koyach hatzimtzum. So now I'm going to continue reading top of page 1475. What you see from all of this is that the extent that Chassidus will go to be ma'achid. Remember the mitzvah liyachid. It's a mitzvah to connect everything to become one with godliness, that every detail of existence, both the Eira Bligvul, which is a given, Eira Bligvul is clearly expresses the divine Bligvul. The Eira Gvul that manifests and relates to the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. And even the very Helam itself, all is, at the end of the day, all one Shem Echad. It's all part of one Hashem Echad. Which in turn, once we can understand that type of unity, that in turn is going to impact the Nefesh Habamis as well, to also come to a V'haftas Hashem Elokecha. I know I'm jumping, but that's where it's going to lead to. Not in Ayin Beis, because Ayin Beis never gets back to that, but the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, as it is in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, more bekitzer. So let's continue reading on the second line of page 1475 in Ayin Beis. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. And let's continue learning inside. It says like this. Now this is critical, because if you don't have a tzimtzum, then what you have is 2 tracks coming from Atzmus, ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, like he says, the ayin, I should say, they're both ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. He made that clear. But the ayin shalamayla legamri b'chinas yesh, the ayin that's a mokali yesh, and that's that. So far, from Atzmus' point of view, good. He wants two forces at work here. But bottom line is, from the Eibishter's point of view, it's all one. It's the Eibishter wants two different things. So how is that going to manifest in a way that's going to relate to existence? Hishtalshelus. So now comes into play another force, the Koyach Tzimtzum. The Pa'ulas Tzimtzum was shenivdal b'chinas Ayin Beis ma'ayin Aleph. In other words, take away the Tzimtzum, then Kol Yochel, the Eibishter can do anything. We've talked about that many times. But he wants it to make sense. So now he employs another power. It's called concealment. A concealment that separates between the ayin, second ayin from the first ayin. So let me give a simple example. It's an example I've given in the past. The king is in his palace, and he calls in two of his ministers. He appoints two ministers. One is the Sara Pnim, and one is Sara Chutz. One is the interior minister, one is the foreign minister. What's the difference? The interior minister mainly works with the king inside the palace, inside his staff, with the people that are close to him. The foreign minister, the Sara Chutz, like the name implies, deals with the subjects outside the palace, with the different cities and municipalities throughout the kingdom, sending them the right to guidelines and orders and so on. Now the king is one king. Both ministers are completely buckled to the king. They both have to do their job faithfully, no matter what they're doing. The difference between them is only in their implementation, what they do. Just like you say, there's the person who does the cooking, and the person who's the Sara Ephim, there's the Sara Mashpia. There's the one who runs the minister of baking, of the bakery, and there's the minister of the mashka, of the drinks. So the difference is in their pula, what they're doing. But from the point of view of the king, they both have equal authority, and they're both buckled to the king completely. That's what they're. So the king wants two different functions. Now, if it just remained that these two ministers are standing before the king inside the palace, then they would, and they never make any, and they don't change, and they don't ever leave the inner sanctum. They just get their orders. You're not going to get the job done. So though they're both bottled completely, and they're both aligned with what the king wants, now they have to implement it, and they have very different roles. So what creates that implementation? That's where the Tzimtzum comes in. The Tzimtzum is now saying, both of you leave now my presence. One of you, your job is to express me, like the ayin, the gamri l'maylam k'nis sayesh, the higher ayin, and the other ayin, your job is to go out to the field or go out to the people and talk to them what they need to hear. So the Tzimtzum is now revealing, and I should say executing and implementing these two directions. If not, it would be like two talmidim, two students who are sitting in front of the teacher, and they're completely absorbed and completely subjugated to the teacher. They're not doing their job. So you need the Tzimtzum that the nivdal b'chinas Ayin Beis ma'ayin Aleph, v'nasa b'chinas richuk min Atzmus. And this second level of Ayin has a job to do. The job is to go and to create an existence that does not feel and is not close to, in other words, does not reflect all of Atzmus. It only reflects the part of Elokus that's going to relate to existence. So in other words, even though that Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is rooted all the way in Atzmus, like he said, just like the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, but you need another step to have it do its function, and its function is to relate to existence, to be a Mokir be'erech li'ez b'chinas Mokir. So the Tzimtzum is what implements and creates a certain next move, a next stage that is not just two Eidos that are coming from the Etzem, but they're two Eidos that have a different function. Even though from the Atzmus point of view, they're both, like from the Melech's point of view, they're both fulfilling his Ratzon. The Zeu HaMavur, the Kama Mekemis, and this is what is explained in a number of places, the Bechlolis, and in general there are three levels, Hen Gimel Madregas. Yesh, V'ayin v'yesh. There's the yesh, hainu, yesh amiti. That's Atzmus, yesh amiti, the true reality. The yesh hanivra, the created reality, which is creation. V'ayin shebeneim. And there's the ayin shebeneim. The ayin is the carrier. Like we said, the Eibishter wants to express himself, reveal himself. So the ayin is like the interface between the two. And then he continues, Va'ayin nechlak l'shnayim. And this ayin divides into two. Like he said before, V'hainu she'ein ze ayin ma'ayin. It's not like there's one level of ayin, and now through being diminished comes another level of ayin. It's not ayin ma'ayin. Both levels of ayin come from the yesh amiti. And they both are equal because in the presence of the mocker, the yesh, they both have they're equally reflective of Elokus, or what the Eibishter wants. But that same thing, but then the Tzimtzum creates that there should be that the ayin should split into two, not that one should come from the other. Ki'im sha'ayin u'bebeis madreges, that the ayin itself is in two levels. V'koydem havdalah hayuklulim yachad. Before the separation, before they left the king's palace, so to speak, when they're in the presence of the king, they're klulim yachad, they're both encompassed together. The klulim u'miyachadim be'ein seif baruch hu, and they're all encompassed and one with ein seif baruch hu. They had tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is essentially them leaving so-called the presence of the king directly under his, like the light of the sun going outside of the sun, kavyachol. They had tzimtzum v'apasa. Through the concealment and through the partition, nechla ka'ayin l'shnayim. The ayin splits into two, separates into two, the ayin of the yesh amiti and the ayin of the yesh hanivra, the ayin that's higher than yesh, the yesh of the nivra, and there's the ayin that relates to the yesh, becomes a mocker to the yesh. And now the Rebbe Rashab is going to give a mashal for this. I said, we've learned this already. But again, doesn't hurt learning again. So let's do the mashal, then I'll stop for any questions. The mashal will help understand this a lot better. The Yuvan Zal derech hamashal hayedua, and this will be understood like al derech hamashal hayedua, the famous mashal, the mashal of Mashpia Mekabel, of a teacher and a student. Be'inyan hashpos haseichel ma Mashpia leMekabel. The hashpah, the transmission of intelligence, of intellect from a mashpia, from the transmitter to a recipient. So what do we see when that happens? This is an example. This is an example, a classic example that Alter Rebbe always gives for the Eibishter being mashpia to existence, like a mashpos seichel from mashpia to mekabel. Haria ur seichel kamoishu eitzla mashpia. The ur seichel, the power of the intelligence, the way it is by the mashpia, meaning by the teacher, it's not commensurate to the recipient at all. Because we're talking about a teacher, a brilliant teacher, that's infinitely apart, or not infinitely, but quite far distant from the Mekabel. So it's not be'erech. His seichel and his seichel are very far apart, and that's why there has to be some steps in order for him to convey the idea, like he's going to explain. Ach nimtzeboy, however, because he's going to be a mashpia to the Mekabel, and he just remains distant from him, he'll never be mashpia to him. If you have a genius that's a completely different level than the student, who doesn't even come close in any way to understand him, how they're ever going to meet. So now he says, no, but since he's a mashpia, nimtze boy, within him, within the mashpia, you can find within him another gamma er seichel hashaychel Mekabel. So as he wants to teach, so even though his pure seichel, undiluted, is completely beyond the Mekabel, but he also has another level of seichel, that's shaychel and Mekabel. However, it's not discernible. It's not distinct. You can't tell. No, if you see a teacher sitting at his books, learning, and you see he's brilliantly involved, immersed in his understanding of the idea, he's not teaching yet the student. But he's going to become a teacher, So in his mind, he also has another level, which is not obvious, because at that point, it's all encompassed in his one seichel. His seichel includes the ideas as he understands them, but it also includes the way he's going to convey them to a student. In other words, he has within him the capacity to convey this. He's going to need a Tzimtzum, as we're going to learn, to actually convey it. But even before the Tzimtzum, he has that capacity, even though it's not Nikar yet. So it's a lot of things that we find that though they have not yet, they're not obvious yet, doesn't mean that they're not there. So he says it's there, but it's not Nikar. Shlo yaya Nikar. Sheina Nikar klal. Vayidei. So then how does the process work? So the first thing you need is that the teacher has within him that seichel that he can convey to a student, even though he hasn't done so. Because if he didn't have that, all the tzimtzum in the world wouldn't help. In other words, the teacher has to have the capacity to be able to relate to the student. Now comes, how do you implement that? How do you execute that? When he now diminishes the seichel within himself, he basically starts focusing and saying, of this brilliant idea, I'm only going to convey a surface part of a certain part of it, certain basics. She's mitzamtzum seichel ba'atzmei. Nimtze bo'ya'ir ha'seichel ha'shayachel Mekabel. So even though before he did that, it was there, but it was completely submerged within the brilliance of his infinite intelligence. Now when he does Tzimtzum within himself, so what he's doing is, this Oyer, he's essentially drawing out from his own brilliance, he's drawing out, let's say the idea has, 1,000 pages of material. I'm going to convey to my student 5 pages, the first 5 pages of it. I don't mean pages, I mean a certain limited amount that's going to emerge from him. Just like you see an artist, he can't just let everything flow. He has to diminish and channel the art to express itself in a particular type of art. So this is the Tzimtzum Seichel about Nimtze B'er Seichel Shashaychel Mekabel. The Seichel Hazeh, this Seichel that he's now allocated, that he's going to convey to a student, and he hasn't conveyed it yet. Hoyetzli Kfar Kishihiskelas HaSeichel Atzmei. It existed. What's not a new creation? It existed Kfar already when he was conceiving of the idea within himself. He also had the seichel that he would use to convey to a student. However, it wasn't obvious yet. Think of an ocean, a large ocean of water. It also has water that could be drawn out and someone can use for whatever purpose. But as long as it's part of this big ocean, it's all submerged in the ocean and you don't see that specific function. When you create the tzimtzum, that you're going to now allocate some of that water that's going to be delivered, let's say on the beach, that's going to wash over the beach, it was there before, the water. However, it was still all part of the ocean. Now it's being transmitted and coming up on the beach. Same idea. So it's not nikr, but it was there. And it's the tzimtzum that he creates within himself, where it becomes obvious, this seichel that relates to the student, the nivdal, and separated la'atzmei. It's still with la'atzmei, v'nivdal la'atzmei. Well, la'atzmei actually means la'atzmei as an entity of its own. Nivdal la'atzmei. It becomes something separate from the original all-encompassing intelligence. That's the example he gives here. So what do you see from this? That the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is not coming from the ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. They're both there in his seichel, except it's not nikr. And you need the tzimtzum to allow yourself to draw it out from the teacher. So the same thing lamaila, like he says, v'adugma is a lamaila. And the example of this lamaila is the b'chinas gila era Atzmus yesh b'zeh beis madregas. In the gila era Atzmus, the first initial oyer, it's not one level of oyer and later will become another level. There's 2 levels. Ha'echad b'chinas er v'agila la'atzmei kavyachol, One is the light and the reflect and the expression and the revelation for himself, so to speak. Ukamoy, like we say, hivdilu la'atzmei, when it says that he the able to create an er b'yem rishon, and he separated for himself. It's not for any other purpose. It's only for himself. And he, right from the outset, created also an air that would be tzedek for the purpose of creation of the worlds. However, initially, that second level of air is not discernible and separate as a separate entity. Everything is part of that one ocean, part of that one seichel, one oir. He goes even further, and this oir, which is allocated for the purpose of existence, even though it's not yet discernible, it's on the same quality and the same level as the first level of Ayin. Why not? They're both coming from Atzmus. It's two different functions. But from Atzmus' point of view, they're both fulfilling what he wants. So they all are either equal. So even though from the recipient's point of view, it's going to be chitzenis haseichel, it's only the outer dimension of what the teacher is teaching. But by the teacher, the chitzenis is like the pnimius. And there's a point where you can't distinguish between them until there's that Tzimtzum that distinguishes. Everything is miyuchad. That's the ultimate achdus. Everything is united by Atzmus Yisbarach. And the divine revelation and expression radiates in the outer just like in the inner. No difference. So what makes the difference? Then there's a power of Tzimtzum that separates, that conceals. Nivdal v'nifresh hachetzenis min hapnimius. The outer gets separate and detached from the inner, as a separate track of energy, and a diminished level of energy, because it has to fit into the kelim of the student, of the recipient, of the worlds. And he tells us, so look in the Maimer, the Rosh Hashanah Maimer, Tov Reish Ayin Ches. And with that, he concludes this paragraph. So clearly you see here why both questions are answered. One is, why is it two levels of Ayin, not one? If it's all equal. Because the Eibishter wanted two. It's not that there's a second one that comes afterwards. He wanted initially. The Eibishter is as distant from he's beyond the first level of Ayin just as much as the second level. And the same way he's expressed in the second just as much as the first. And it also answers the question. So it's not Ayin ma'ayin, it's both Ayins from the Yesh. And the Tzimtzum is what ultimately separates, that allows that to be two tracks, therefore to allow existence to be created. And the second point is his savus, because the Eibishter wants that from the outside. His savus is not just due to our blindness that we don't see. The Eibishter wanted a world. He wanted a yesh, and he wanted an ayin that would fit into that yesh from the beginning. It's not just something that becomes in later stages. The later stages reveals it through the Tzimtzum, but it's not that it creates it. The creation begins right away from the beginning. The Eibishter wanted the creation, and therefore that creation will have real substance. But from the Eibishter's point of view, that creation is just like complete bittul mitzvah. It's like no creation. Ani rishon v'ani achne. Atuhu, the atuhu misha nivre'elim, atu la'achrisha nivre'elim. There's no difference, because it's all God's expression. And the example of the teacher really drives the point home. And all this is an addition of the Rebbe Rashab that is not in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer to explain how the two levels of Ayin are like one. And while they're also still two, there's Kel Deus Havaya, Das Elyon, Das Tachten, but they're both one from the point of view of the Eibishter, of Atzmus. Okay. Any questions?
That makes sense. That makes sense. But still, I know I asked that already. He had a second question. It said, "Bereshit bara Elokim."
I just explained it.
What?
The
That
Eibishter's
this is both.
existence exists because the Eibishter's kayak to create existence. It's a lakus in the form of existence.
But the creation is also elokus. It's not a separate.
We're talking about
existence.
creation. Creation is elokus in the form of Isavus, a form of Bereshit bara Elokim.
Which is not something different than elokus, right? That's what I'm
From
told.
Elokus' point of view, there's no difference. But he wants Isavus. Isavus is part of Elokus, just like none is not just like none Isavus is part of Elokus.
So, what is Histavus? What is Histavus?
It's a koyach eliki to create a yesh. That's what Isavus is, and that yesh is Elokus, like he said in Teda Shalom. You're not going to get it from my answers. You're going to have to harave and read it again and again, because whatever I'm going to say, you're going to go in circles, as you see. I would open up the
with this
Shalom.
point. The yesh is the feeling. What is the yesh? Is this the feeling?
From the point of view of Atzmus, it's another power of Atzmus that he created a yesh. That we see the yesh. We see the yesh. You're talking about from our point of view or from the Eibishter's point of view?
Our point of view.
Our point of view, you don't feel Elokus. Look at the world. The yesh does not feel Elokus altogether. Well, we need a Isbonanus. From our point of view, it's not even a question. The question is not from our point of view. The question is from the Eibishter's point of view. From our point of view, there's a whole world around us. There's an ego. There's a yesh. There's a nefesh habamis. You need proof that we feel that we are separate from Elokus. It's 24/7. It's what makes us be who we are. That we don't feel bittul mitzias. We don't feel that we are just an extension of godliness. We feel independent consciousness, independent entity. That's very clear from our point. The question is how the Eibishter sees it.
But our point of view means that the Eibishter made it should be such kind of a point of view. The reality,
and it's a true point of view. But the Eibishter, when he looks at it from his eyes, there's no tzimtzum by the Eibishter. So he sees the Elokus in the yesh itself. He sees it as an extension of Elokus, even though we are limited and don't see it. Like he said,
we don't see it. We feel that we are a separate thing. But the reality is that this is Hashem, godliness, that He made,
and that's what
it should be such a thing.
And that's Avedus Hashem to get to that reality, to become aware of the true reality. Yes.
When he says that the Chitzonius is like the Pneumius, at what point is the Chitzonius? You're going to probably, I guess, you're going to say it all depends. It's Chitzonius as soon as he starts to separate from anything separate from Atzmus, it's Chitzonius. But I don't know if you can say
I wouldn't put it that way. I would go back to the example. The seichel that is the brilliant, infinite seichel that he has, and then there's the seichel that's there, that's not obvious yet, which is going to relate to a student. That's Chitzonius compared to that. But at this level, the Chitzonius and Pneumius are like the ocean example I gave, that even a drop of water is all part of the large ocean from that perspective. So the Chitzonius is essentially what will happen afterwards. That part of that which was all encompassed as one will become, like, let's say, like I said, a teacher, let's say, I'll just use, I gave the example, he knows 1,000 pages of material about a certain idea. He can't convey 1,000 pages to a student. He's going to convey one page. In his mind, the one page is just like the 1,000 pages. But from what one says, the Tzimtzum is going to be a Chitzonius. It's only one out of 1,000 pages. So for him, the Chitzonius and Pneumius are one. But bottom line is that one page is going to be only one page from the point of view of the student.
So that was my follow-up question, which I think you just answered. But Chitzonius, we start to understand a concept of Chitzonius after the Tzimtzum Harishon, or after the
parsa. Not understand, it becomes discernible. After the tzimtzum within this teacher, when the teacher says, I am now moving away from just me understanding the 1,000 pages. I now want to convey this to a student, and I have to spoon feed it. Before there's even a student around, that shift in the teacher is now allowing for what we call chitzenius, or what he calls earlier that oir shayach el Mekabel to become nicker, because now he knows what he's going to convey. A moment before that, it's all encompassed in the one thing. I gave a bunch of examples. Let's say, like I said, the example of the ocean. All the water is encompassed together, and then there's a part of that will be conveyed. As soon as he decides that he wants to convey it, so then as it begins what he calls what's nikir and nivdil b'fnei atzmi.
All right. Now I understood all those mashalim. I guess that I'm asking something more, doctrinal. In the Seder Hishtalshalis, where do we see chitzonius first? After the Tzimtzum Harishan, or from Atzilus into Bria?
No, even before the Tzimtzum, if you know how to look.
Well, that's what I said. When he starts to think on
before the Tzimtzum, you have the oyer legalis la'atzmei. You look when he said the two. There's the hivdilu la'atzmei, gili la'atzmei. So even before the Tzimtzum, we've learned that subtly there's the oyer as it's revealed to himself, and there's the oyer that he's allocating for the world that will come. The Tzimtzum Harishan is going to actualize that. And then you'll actually see a kav. In lower worlds, it'll come through Atzilus and Biyah. So it'll be through all the levels. But if you're asking where it begins, in the earliest so-called genesis of it, the stirrings are as soon as Atzmus says, I want to have a dira b'tachtenim, you already have, like he said, 2 levels of ayin, except they're not discernible yet. Because they're all part of Atzmus' desire. Like he said, they're all klulim yachad. So that's the whole point here, that Atzmus from the highest level wants these 2 levels of ayin. It's not that one later will be created by the first one. They're both initially from the outset, from the plan, from the beginning includes both, but the Tzimtzum is what allows it to emerge.
Understood. One last question for now anyways. I'm not yet at my quota. You gave a class once, I think, on the beginnings of consciousness, and it was a very, very delicate explanation, logical progression, how the Eberster from Atzmus begins to conceptualize anything other than himself. And is that the point at which we start to talk about something that's chitzoni?
I don't know if I'm sure there's some parallels between what I spoke about then and here, but I would have to really look closer what I said and what I was referring to. But it's not just about the other, really. It's also about, I've spoken a number of times that, remember, Atzmus is higher than consciousness and awareness altogether. That's why you have an Eira level that he calls it Koydem Alei Saratzi, that he himself is not even aware of that level. Not because he is ignorant of it, but because awareness has not yet emerged. The concept of awareness is not, like self-consciousness is not there yet. There's no consciousness. So it all begins that Etzem fundamentally is Etzem built in Mizgala. Etzem defies expression and defies revelation. So as soon as Atzmus chooses to express, that's Oyer. That's what Oyer means. That built in Mitzias Nimtza, the non-existential, non-conscious, or I would say beyond conscious and beyond awareness, is just choosing to come into a state of being. We'll call it a field of energy, a field of consciousness, of divine consciousness. In that divine consciousness, he's saying there's 2 levels. One is as he relates to himself, more like the Oyer that is beyond existence, and the other is the Oyer where he relates to existence, what he calls the Ayin of the Mokar Liyesh, or later afterwards the Ayin Hashayach Mekabel, and that itself, just for the record, has many levels. So if that parallels what I said then about the birth of consciousness, perhaps. If I recall correctly, I was speaking on lower levels, more Keser to Chachma, not necessarily on the levels we're talking here. This is far, far higher, but there's similarities. for sure, because this happens many times throughout the cosmic order. You're going to have a constant process of, as things get from a more abstract to a more concrete or congealed state, you have that happening throughout, because it's all spiritual levels. But here he is talking very high levels, because he's talking Yesh Amiti, Atzmus. So there, as I said, there's definitely similarities to what I spoke about there.
Thank you very, very much. And welcome back, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? Again, I would recommend looking in the Torah Shalom that I learned when we finished Ayin Beis. If you may recall, we learned a few texts, and one of them was Torah Shalom. Before I went over to the Torah Eir and Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, we learned Torah Shalom. We may have learned something else as well. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Could you remind us which page it was?
Simchas Torah Ayin Dalet. I don't remember the page now. But it's all recorded, so all the classes were recorded, so you can find it pretty relatively easily. So I would recommend reading that closely. It'll help understand some of these ideas. You know, to use maybe a very technology example, you know, when you use your smartphone or your laptop or desktop, so you have many interfaces there that allow you to use it so it's user-friendly, right? There's a user interface, which means there's a keyboard or there's touch screen. You touch things, and in turn it triggers all the right impulses and generates, even though there's nothing physical in there, but it generates the right program. But while you're doing that, if someone were able to see, or someone who wrote the machine language, and they were able to tell you when you press that button, what really is happening is zeros and ones in the core machine program are just being triggered. No, we don't see that. We see the outer. We don't see the molecular, and definitely not the atomic and subatomic structure of things. So if someone said, what is this havus? What's creation? So you say, well, from my eyes, from my perspective, it's what I see, what I hear, what I taste, touch, and smell. Here's a table. Here's a cup of water. Here's fire. And they all have properties. Water is wet, fire is dry, fire burns. They all have different properties and different qualities and personality and so on. But if you were to look from the molecular or the subatomic, or in this case, from the computer language level, what would you see? The same thing would exist, but you're seeing the forces that are shaping it. Now, for a trained eye, which is true in every area of, even in commerce and business, trained eyes see things that we don't see. You know, a good doctor, tell them the symptoms, and with a few key questions and a few little testing things, the doctor will come back and give you a whole report about something that you say, I never saw any of it. Or people who are very experienced in seeing patterns, economic patterns, or other patterns. If you have a trained eye, you'll see things that no one else sees. It's not a miracle, and it's not magic. It's just that you have the eyes that are trained to not look at the dots, but you know how to connect the dots. I'm giving very simple examples. So if you could go into Atzilus, how would Atzilus look at this world? It'll see it as divine code, divine energy. Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, the combination. It's all Elikus. If you talk from Atzmus' point of view, it's not even Atzilus. Atzilus is a world, a structure with spheres. It's just the spheres is the spiritual. Think of it more like spiritual molecules or spiritual atoms. But you're not going to get to the very core. If Atzmus looks at the world, it's simply a power of Atzmus. Just like he has the power to reveal light and express himself in light, He has the power to conceal. So says power. Hein hein v'reisav. He has the power to create existence with all the properties that existence has. It's all part of God's powers. So purely from Atzmus' point of view, everything looks very different than how we see things. That's why ultimate achdus, say Hashem Echad, really means not there was one God, that everything is just an extension of His reality. It all depends what form and shape it takes from our point of view, but it's all Elokus. That's ultimately Kel Deus Havaya. We are not on that level. Our goal is to go step by step. First, to take what we do experience and align it, instead of to our own selfish needs, we align it to what God wants of us. And then you climb. You climb through Asiya, through Yetzirah, through Bria, through Atzilus, to Keser, Ak, all the way back to the Kav, till Lifnei Tzimtzum, and then you can come to the levels. Remember, again, this is the conclusion of Ayin Beis. The Rebbe Rashab is expecting that after reading 1,475 pages of till here, that we have acclimated ourselves to some extent to the lower levels. So now he's able to introduce us to these highest levels. But don't think that these levels are exactly easy to access. It's the ultimate. You're talking now coming to the peak of the mountain where everything joins. It's like where everything comes, the whole diversity of existence. All the rivers go back to the sea, and the sea all goes back to its source, to that Hashem Echad source. That's what we're talking about here. That all the different levels, and namely these two, especially these two big ones, the Aselian, the Astachten, Yichud the Tata, Yichud the Ilah, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, all come together as they emerged from the Hashem Echad in the first place. That's the ultimate place to go to. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that it's not that easy to us to understand that, because we have plenty of challenges to understand Yichud Tata even, which is on lower levels, let alone. But the Rebbe Rashab is laying it all out. And as I said, this is an elaboration on what the Mittler Rebbe says, which is in turn an elaboration of what the Alter Rebbe says, all explaining what is the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, which will then lead us to Baruch Shem and to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, which we shall get to, but not there yet. So we're now, middle paragraph, finish the paragraph on page 1475. There's another 2 pages to go till the end of Ayin Beis. Then we shall return to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, because Ayin Beis now is explaining essentially page 381 and 382 of the Mittler Rebbe, with many additions here. In the Mittler Rebbe, you're not going to find many of the ideas we just read and discussed. But the kernel of the ideas are there, because he does say that the 2 days come together, where you tough is Bekul Alman, the less man the tough is Bay. You have both a combination of being, God contains it all, but nothing contains or defines him, which is really like the Odneina Min Amida, that whole balance, that whole, that paradox, that ultimate paradox. So we'll stop here, middle of page 1475. And again, bear in mind, we have learned this. We learned this in depth the first time around. Now we're learning it after we've learned the Mittler Rebbe, so we can contextualize that. Okay. And I should add what I've said a number of times, it's critical to go through the lower levels. Because if we jumped straight to this highest level, we would be annihilated in its presence. The key is that we first build the kalim, like the student. The student can't go to the pnimius haseichel of the brilliance of the teacher without first understanding the chitzenius, as he puts it, that which relates to him. Through that, he climbs, and his horizons expand, and his containers expand. And as he gets older, 40 years, he can begin to understand and beyond. So it's critical that we first internalize and absorb that which we can absorb. In other words, if you don't learn Aleph Beis, you're never going to understand the deepest idea. You first have to know how to read. You need to learn the letters. Even though those letters are all part of the bigger picture, but you need to learn them on your level. And as you climb and grow, you can absorb more and more till every person on their level the Fum Shura delay reaches these higher levels of Yichud. Okay. So that concludes the paragraph. Page 1475. We'll stop here. Before I stop the recording, does anyone want to ask anything else? Any questions on this topic? That is.